This is podcast five, group five. Group members are myself, Jayana, Kawan, Caitlin, and Aaliyah. So this is episode five, chapter five, selected response assessment. The objectives, there's five. So one is make an assessment blueprint for a selected response assessment. Two, write propositions for knowledge and reasoning targets. Three, create selected response items for each format option. Four, audit a selected response assessment for quality. And five, use selected response assessments formally with students. And so a brief overview is in this chapter. We learn about creating selected response assessments, when to use them, the correct and wrong way to assess when using selected assessments, and how to use them with students.
So I have objective one, which of course is make an assessment blueprint for selected response assessment. Um, an assessment blueprint serves as a sampling plan that ensures alignment between learning targets and assessment items. According to chapter five, the blueprint that identifies the learning targets, the type of target, knowledge, or reasoning, the number of items or points per target, and then the assessment method, for example, like the selected response. Below, which I'm reading this how I wrote it, but below is an example blueprint for a selected response assessment in middle school civics unit. So what I did, although I typically would have taken this and tied it back to me, but I just thought the idea was good. But this example is selected response assessment blueprint. The unit is basically on structure and functions of U.S. government. And then there are five learning targets, and then I'll go over what the formats are for each one. So, like for number one, is identify the three branches of U.S. government. You have the target type, which is knowledge, number of items for, and then the format is like multiple choice. The second one is describe the powers of each branch. Again, the target type is knowledge, number of items is five, and then multiple choice. And then number three, explain how checks and balances limit power. The target type is knowledge, item number of items is four, and then that's more so true or false format. Then number four, compare responsibilities of the House and Senate. This target type is reasoning and also comparison, number of items three, and then multiple choice as the format. And then last one, number five, analyze how laws move through Congress. So this target type will be reasoning, sequent analysis, and then number of items four, and then format for that would be matching. So equaling out to a total number of items being 20. And then, of course, this blueprint reflects several principles from chapter five. Selected response is best suited for knowledge targets and some reasoning targets. The sample size increases when decisions carry more weight, for example, like summative grading. And then reasoning items like comparison and analysis is require students to apply knowledge, not just recall the facts. Items are distributed proportionally based on instructional emphasis. And then, of course, the blueprint ensures alignment between instruction and assessment, balanced representation of targets, and then adequate sampling for valid inferences.
So, objective number two is write propositions for knowledge and reasoning targets. So, propositions are statements of important facts, concepts, and results of applying a pattern of reasoning that you want students to master. So, you can use propositions that can be on a test and then create a response item to reflect that content. So propositions can be thought of as the statement of the right answer. In this section in the book, they use an example in the blueprint where students are learning about westward expansion on Native Americans and Mexicans. The proposition given here was called the three effects of westward expansion on Plains Indians were increased disease, removal to reservation lands, and the loss of food sources. What made that a proposition is that it stated three effects you want students to know in result of what they study. You can create both knowledge and reasoning propositions. You can also create propositions for interpretive exercises, which will be specific to the content to which the pattern of reasoning is to be applied. To write them, you first have to locate the information they are to interpret. So for this example, it pointed us to the reading assessment blueprint, which included the learning target, infer a character's feelings. So for this target, you would need to select a reading passage, and that text must provide evidence for the proposition. You can also build items for tests from propositions and select propositions for tests. However, sometimes writing propositions are not needed for certain learning targets. The learning target itself will provide more than enough information.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting the examples they provided of like the counting and then the like one about the ostrich where you gave it away by putting an instead of a. So I thought that was interesting. I had objective number 3, which was create selected response items for each format option. And so it talked about multiple choice, true, false, matching, and fill in formats, and gave some guidelines for each one. And so the main thing for all of them was to write clearly and in a focused manner. So, not trying to make the questions or the propositions very wordy. Um, Make sure you ask an actual question. Aim for the lowest possible reading level. So, that way your student is not being necessarily deterred by proficiency in reading if they still have the content mastered, which I thought was really important. The eliminate cluing, that's what I was talking about with the ostrich example, and like not letting your blanks be longer for the longer answers, or your grammar give it away. Um, and then having somebody who's qualified, like a colleague, review test questions, especially for those more summative tests. Um, Double checking to make sure your scoring is accurate before scoring. And so the guide in figure 5.9 was really helpful for me about when to use multiple choice, true, false, matching, and fill in the blank. And it provided insight to advantages and limitations for all of them. So, multiple choice was great for questions that have only one right answer, or they have like a all of the above or none of the above options. It's easy to score, but then the limitation was that it could be hard, or it could be easy to skew the answers because they can guess with a 33% chance of accuracy. True false was good to test large bodies of content. It was also relatively easy to score, but it can also be misleading if you write it um, in that way. And so that could also skew true mastery of content for students. Matching um, can cover a lot of material. It's easy to score, but if you have the exact same number of questions and answers, they can also guess on that. And then fill in the blank covers a lot of material, and it eliminates guessing, but it takes longer to score because you are having to like kind of hand do it. So I thought that was a really helpful chart when talking about creating options for each format. I also had objective number 4, which was audit a selected response assessment for quality. And I liked the guide on this on 5.10. I thought that checklist was super helpful. And so basically it had 8 different categories to kind of ask yourself to make sure that your assessment is good. So Number 1 was general guidelines for all formats. And in that, it talks about making sure you're asking a question, keeping wording simple, making sure that the correct choice isn't obvious unless they truly have mastered the content, which was a good reminder for me. Number 2 was specifically for multiple choice items, and it was talking about, eliminating repetition, keeping the options brief and parallel, and not using the all of the above or none of the above like too much, keeping that sparing when it was truly appropriate for the question. Um, the guideline for true false was pretty simple. Just make sure it's completely true or completely false instead of having students, worry about being tricked or something like that. Um, Number 4 was guidelines for matching items. So it was providing clear directions, keeping like questions together. So not using matching for, I think the example in the book was like the correct answer was like cities and states, I believe. And then the incorrect answer was like some cities and states, some dates, some it looked like some like coins or like state logos or things like that. For number 5, it was for fill-in items. So one blank per item, put the blank towards the end of the statement, and making sure that the length doesn't give you a clue. Number 6 was formatting test items. So just consistency, which I know we all like. So that's good for our students as well. Not breaking up the test questions on more than one page, like going ahead and formatting it that way. It also talked about arranging some easy questions at the beginning to reduce test anxiety, which I thought was like super helpful, and I never thought of that before to like ease students into the test. Um, and then also just making sure that you're not crowding too many questions on one page. And then number 7 was writing the directions and making sure those are clear for each different type of selected response question, making sure you state the point value and assigning the ones that have more weight to it, making those worth more, and making sure that the student knows how to correctly put their answer. So if it should be rounded, what unit you're looking for, um, do you write out true and false or do you put a T and an F? That type of thing. And then a big thing it talked about several times was time, which was number 8 on the checklist. So making sure that students have the appropriate amount of time to answer the questions so that they don't feel rushed, that they are given adequate time to truly show like content mastery, because sometimes we're like, okay, well, yeah, if they can't read it, that is an issue with learning, but that's not what your assessment is supposed to assess unless you're assessing reading level. So I thought that was really important um, thing to remember when we're looking at making our assessments.
I had objective 5, use selected response assessments for timely with students. So this section of the chapter, we go back to chapter 2, where we discuss the 7 strategies of assessment for learning. So in this chapter, those 7 strategies were linked to selected response instruments. So the instruments, they were broken up into 3 sections. Section 1, where am I going? 2, where am I now? And 3, how can I close the gap? In the first section, where am I going? It covered strategy 1 and 2. Strategy 1, which is provide students with a clear and understandable vision of the learning target. So with this strategy, the author recommended making sure that your learning targets are written in a language that students will understand. If it's a test, the blueprint is being used or shared with students so that it can help them develop the understanding the learning goal, that learning is the goal. So in strategy 2, examples of strong and weak work. the author uses the example of instead of asking the student to identify the correct answer, ask them to identify the wrong answer and explain why it is wrong. So in section 2, where am I now? That covered strategies 3 and 4. So strategy 3, offer regular descriptive feedback during the learning. This occurs after the list of learning targets or assessment blueprint has been completed. The author says to create two versions of the same test, Form A and Form B. Once the student has completed the assessment and has been graded, they receive their test back along with the reviewing my results worksheet. Students will then transfer the information from their quiz to the worksheet by marking in the right or wrong column for each problem, determining if there's mistakes and was it due to misunderstanding. Once they've done that, they will mark the corresponding column fixable mistakes or don't get it for each incorrect answer. Lastly, they will complete the second part of the worksheet, which is analyzing my results, where they list if they are good or need improvement. So, strategy 4, teach students to self-assess and set goals for next steps. After the student has completed the assessment, they will use the information from it to self-assess. They can set goals for further studying by completing the part of analyzing my results that asks them to make a plan for what they will do to get better at the targets they have not mastered. And then lastly, in section 3, how can I close the gap? It covers the last 3 strategies. Strategy 5, use evidence of student learning needs to determine next steps in teaching. So using Form A that was mentioned previously as a pretest and Form B as a post-test. You can use the sections on Form A pertaining to each learning target as quizzes to check for understanding and prepare further instruction as needed before moving on to the next learning target. Strategy 6, design focused instruction, followed by practice with feedback. So once the students have completed the worksheet, reviewing and analyzing my results, you as a teacher can use this information to better differentiate instruction. Students with fixable mistakes may need to follow up on correcting their answers and explaining what their mistake was, while other students may need more support, like additional worksheets or just one on one time with the teacher. And lastly, strategy 7, provide opportunities for students to track, reflect on, and share their learning progress. Set up systems for students to track their formative assessment information and summative assessment work. Organize them by learning targets and periodically asking them to reflect on their progress and how they're doing thus far.
I really liked the reviewing my results worksheet. I thought that was super helpful for like teachers and students.
Yes.
Do any of y'all do that at y'all school? I feel like we do a lot of what chapter 5 is saying personally at my school. We do it within like small groups. And then when we have like these, I call them like mini data conversations, like when it's not really going to happen toward the end of the year, right before they take their EOGs, like just showing them like where they're projected, what they have the potential to make, what they made, all of those things, how many points like in between. And when we're having those like types of conversations, we go in and do like ask them like what do you feel like you could have done better, or what did you feel like you got wrong and why it was wrong. But I feel like that's the only way I see it, unless you're in a like direct core class, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know a lot of the couple of the science teachers like have pretty like strenuous test corrections um so I don't think she uses like a sheet like this, but I think they have to explain what they got wrong and why they got it wrong before they can move on to like restudy and retest. Um
Mhm.
And I know back when I was a student at my school, I think I've talked about this before, but the like learning target, like instead of a straight up grade, it's like a like a 0 or a 100. The math teachers used to all use like red light, green light, yellow light, which drove me nuts as a student because I never knew what the grade was like associated with. So I wanted to like, okay, well if I have 6 greens and 2 yellows, is that an A or not? Um, but she like literally had a physical like poster board in her room with our name, like almost like a behavior chart, but it was with all the
Mm-hmm.
learning targets and the colors. And we had
Mm-hmm.
little sticker, like yard sale stickers that we would put up, so we knew how many targets we had that were green, yellow, and red. Which I do think there is value in that, but I also think you should be able to at least know where like what does this mean when it comes to like a report card.
Where you actually stand and like and bringing up the data talks again. Like we use what's our colors? Red, yellow, blue. No, yellow, red, yellow, blue. Yeah, red, yellow, blue. Red is like you're in the negative. Yellow is like you made progress. Blue is like that's where you want to score it. But interesting. So are we moving on to the reflective questions now?
Yes.
Okay, so I have reflective question one. Which ideas in this chapter did you find most convincing or useful and why? One of the most convincing and useful ideas in this chapter was the emphasis on writing propositions before writing test items. The authors argued that propositions, clear directive statements of essential knowledge or reasoning serve as the foundation for high quality selected response items. Of course, this idea was particularly powerful because it reframes assessment writing as a thinking process rather than simply a question writing task. By first identifying propositions, teachers should clarify the following: what students must know, what reasoning they must apply, what content is most essential. And then this approach reduces vague or trivial questions and ensures alignment with the learning targets. It also makes item writing more efficient because each proposition can be transformed into multiple formats. So, like multiple choice, true, false, fill in, increasing flexibility. And then another highly useful concept was the warning about the myth of objectivity and selected response assessments. Of course, while scoring may appear objective, the design process involves professional judgment, what content to include, how to word the items, and how many questions the assign, per target. This insight reinforces that the assessment quality depends on thoughtful design and not just a format. And then finally, the chapter's discussion of using selected response assessments formatively stood out. Grouping items by learning target and having students analyze their own results promotes ownership. And then this aligns strongly with the assessment for learning principles and shifts testing from a compliance activity to a growth opportunity. But overall, the most compelling takeaway is that high quality selected response assessments require clear learning targets, intentional sampling, thoughtful proposition writing, careful item construction, and reflection and revision.
Critical reflection number two: how does this chapter align with or challenge your own beliefs about teaching and learning? And I said this chapter aligned with my beliefs when it came to how selected response questions are used. So the chapter mentions that selected response questions is used usually in high stakes testings and that some schools have chosen to rely primarily on them in the classroom to prepare for final exams because oftentimes that is often how they are reflected. So this led to me believing that selected response questions should be used, but it shouldn't be the only format. And then the chart I really liked was chart 5.10, where it says the selected response test quality checklist. I feel that very much aligned closely with my personal beliefs about teaching, which and multiple choice questions and selected questions, that they shouldn't be overly complicated and they should be simple and to the point and really shouldn't require much confusion. So that's my takeaway. I believe it really did closely align with my personal beliefs.
So, reflection number 3 is what strategy or idea from this chapter would you feel most confident implementing and why? So, from this chapter, I would feel most confident implementing mixing different testing formats together. So, whether it is true false questions or multiple choice, I believe all of these formats have their benefits with increasing students' critical thinking skills. I could also layer the questions with one another, so tying them together with slight differences helps elongate students' thoughts on certain questions and topics. So, with this process, though, I would want to keep the guidelines for multiple choice, true, false, and matching as simple as possible to ensure clarity. As teachers, we want to challenge students to increase their brains, but also be realistic with our expectations for them to a certain degree. So, not making things too easy, but also not unclear.
I had reflection number 4, which was what part of this chapter makes you feel uncertain, nervous, or hesitant about applying in practice? And while I agree with like all of this stuff and like you should, really plan out your assessments, I do think like the part that is the most like hesitant is just time. And sometimes I feel like as teachers, like I'll just be honest, I don't have time to like pre-plan and double make my test questions before I can go into an assessment. And so I think that that was something, well, I do think that's probably best practice. Like, I don't necessarily think it's like always realistic with all the other things we have going on, but it's definitely a good goal and something that I'm like becoming more mindful of for even though I don't give traditional tests, like just making sure I plan those assessments out further so students really kind of know what they're being asked and also like as we get older in teaching and like have more experience too, hopefully we can kind of draw from those things and it won't be like recreating the wheel every time. But as a beginning teacher, I feel like sometimes I don't have time to like as thoroughly do that as I would want.
I feel like there comes a time. I know I personally do not do that. I'm just now honestly getting to a point to where like assessing them aside from like performative assessments, like actual like tests and quizzes and stuff like that, because our curriculum literally does not require us to do that. But as a school across the board, they're really trying to like implement that. No, if they're being tested in core, they need to be tested also in encore. And we just be like, okay. Now, and is it careers and employment, CTE? Now they actually do like actual tests and stuff like that, but everybody else, if you're on like the business side or if you're in family consumer sciences or computer discoveries or computer science, like we don't test. But I will say this is probably like my first year, coming up on my fourth year, where I am using strategies of testing just to kind of see like where they're actually are at in their understanding of what's happening inside of the classroom. But I'm gonna go ahead and close this out. So within our closing statement, Chapter 5 reinforces that selected response assessments are far more than traditional multiple choice tests. When designed intentionally, they are powerful tools for measuring knowledge and certain types of reasoning. The chapter makes it clear that quality does not come from the format itself, but from the clarity of learning targets, the careful construction of propositions, and the deliberate alignment between instruction and assessment. One of the most important takeaways is that the objectivity in scoring does not eliminate the need for professional judgment and design, but as educators, we are responsible for the ensuring that our assessments truly reflect what we value in student learning. By using blueprints, writing strong propositions, following quality item guidelines, and reviewing assessments critically, we increase the validity, and reliability of the actual results. Ultimately, selected response assessment should not narrow instruction, but also support it. When used thoughtfully, especially in formative ways, they can provide clear feedback, uncover misconceptions, and empower students to take ownership of their learning. This chapter challenges us to move beyond simply giving a test and instead design assessments that are intentional, aligned, and instructionally meaningful.